Oh, yeah.
We are going to do something a little bit different this morning. And we asked Ellen to find 4 volunteers to come up to participate in a little bit of an experience.
A mystical experience.
A mystical experience.
Yeah.
So if Ellen touched your shoulder today and asked you to come up, if you'd come up right now,
Simone Flowers.
we'd be so grateful.
Sylvia
Thank
Powell.
you, Simone.
Glenn
Thank you.
McIntosh and
Excellent.
Rowdy Koenig.
Glenn, excellent. We are blessed. Now what's
Awesome.
going to happen is I'm going to unzip this bag, and each of you are going to have 10 seconds to feel what's
No
inside.
peeking.
No peeking. Okay? And then when you feel it, you're going to go over to Ellen and get a piece of pad and a pencil and write down in legible form so we can read it later what you experienced. Okay? And just 10 seconds, and then we'll go to the next person.
And
all
you
right?
can take a full minute or 2 to write if you want.
Yeah.
Just whatever comes to you, just
and then
let
you
it
can
go.
go back and sit down. You don't even have to talk. So here we go. Here's your mystical experience. Okay? All right. Yes, Glenn's prepared. Thank you. Rowdy.
I don't know if
Okay.
you noticed in our newsletter,
Sylvia.
we had a piece of an orange that was sliced in half, and Kristen was holding it, so the spherical end was facing her, and the flat side was facing me. And we were looking at the same object, but it was very, very different. And so that's what this talk is about, from our perception, our position, how we see the world, and how to honor others.
And our perceptions and where they come from. Every one of us sitting in this sanctuary right now has your own perception of what is happening that's uniquely yours. And we have gained our perception through our life history, through what we have lived, where we've lived.
Yeah.
From the family that we've grown up in, from our educational levels, through our experiences with one another, and we perceive life from a certain perspective.
Yeah, I grew up in the Puget Sound area between Seattle and Tacoma. And my parents are both from Kansas. The Boeing company moved them from Wichita to Seattle in 1958. And so I had all my dad's friends that were also from Wichita that transferred. They stuck together like a little clique. And so I was inculcated with this Kansas Midwestern culture, and every couple of years we'd go back and visit the family. And so I felt very comfortable in the Midwest. And yet it was this influence of my siblings that painted the image of the world. I don't want to say anything too negative this early.
Well, give us a clue.
Well, you know, it's like on the West Coast, typically there's not a whole lot of racism that we didn't see up in the Northwest. You know, I love you, Dad. My father's transitioned a few years ago, but you know, when it came to bigotry, my dad was the poster child for the biggest bigot that I had ever met, because in school I didn't see it. But my father, I just want to say that my father came a long way in his life. He evolved tremendously, and he grew. And so my father demonstrated to me what's the potential of a life, what we can do when we surrender our lives to higher power, to God, to Christ, to whatever.
Mm-hmm. So our perspective comes from our experiences in life, from our level of consciousness, and from where we look at life from. And there's a power in that. There's a recognition of our own understanding. And like Brian was saying about the orange that we used on the video, like let's say it's a watermelon, just for something different. The watermelon's cut in half, and I'm looking at it and it's green. It's different shades of green, and it's a round thing, and he's looking at it.
And my mouth's watering at that red stuff.
And I'm looking at it, I'm like, there is no red stuff. There is just green. How can you even say there is red stuff? And yet, you know, sometimes in our relationships, does this ever happen to you or to your beloved? You know, something happens and you see it totally differently. And there is no red, but from his perspective, there is red. And you kind of get entrenched. Does anybody else ever do that? Okay.
Draw lines.
And pretty soon, you know, I'm on this side and he's on that side, and we're lobbying things back and forth to try and prove our point that we're right and our perspective is the real one and that theirs isn't the real one. See, that's the limitation of our perspective, is where it causes separation between us, where it divides us.
Yeah. The Apostle Paul said, now we see through a glass dimly. We have limited perception in these bodies with our history, kind of, some people, saying, I can't hear a word you're saying, your life is speaking so loud. So maybe we lose the words of what they're saying and we're looking at what they've done. Or, culturally, we can be very blind. We all have blind spots. Everybody has a scotoma, a little blind spot that we don't see. And I had a good buddy from Philadelphia, African-American gentleman, and he used to sing at this church I used to be a part of, and he used to remark at how naive I was growing up on the West Coast. And, we came from two different worlds, and we loved each other, and we worked together, and it was a beautiful relationship. But we saw things very differently historically. And stories. I got to limit the stories.
It's all right, love. So there's power and there's limitation within our perspective. I want to go back to the power part for just a second. Because if you grew up in a household, like I did, where your voice wasn't heard and you really weren't valued, there's a growth process into claiming your voice and your own perspective and giving value to that and understanding that you get to articulate that in the world. And then there comes a point where once you've found your voice, you have to sing with a choir. And you have to hear the other voices in the choir to sing well with them. Otherwise, it doesn't go off so well. Yeah. And so there comes a limitation where you have to almost start becoming curious about the red you don't see. And what is it that my partner is seeing that I'm not seeing?
Yeah, and is the other partner being listened to? Are we allowing the other person to be heard? Sometimes we could be triggered by global events, things happening in our community or city, and we feel like something needs to be done. And oftentimes we're so excited about this that we think everybody else should think the same thing. But depending on where we are in our station in life, our zip code, our level of consciousness, where we're at, what's the right thing to do is going to be different than the person sitting next to you. It's like when there's an emergency and somebody needs to call 911. Somebody needs to perform CPR. Somebody needs to flag down the firefighter. We can't all jump in and do CPR. It won't work. It wouldn't work at all. And so we see the need and we go within. Spirit, what is mine to do? And, there was a season in my life where I wanted to be a chaplain when I was in seminary. I had an experience with hospice chaplaincy and working in a hospital. And I was so drawn to hospice chaplaincy because everybody is so present when someone transitions. To be there the moment when somebody breathes their last breath. There's this energy that those hospice chaplains walk in. They're constantly present. And it seems like nothing rocks them. And I was so drawn to that. But when I brought it to Spirit and I prayed on it, I was like, no. But I was really leaning that way. But I was like, no, I'm supposed to do pulpit ministry. And it, obviously, it led me here. And you had a different draw that you wanted to do.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed prayer as well. But I found myself in the national headquarters working with communications, which was a whole different world. And then Spirit drew me into pulpit ministry, which has been the biggest blessing of my entire life. To be in community with people, to open your heart, to be loved, and to love another at this degree it blows me away. And it's a sacred calling. And what we're trying to say here about perspective is that what Brian said earlier is that we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face. That as we have our own perspective, when I was in meditation this morning, this vision came to me of the light of God is showing through each and every one of us. And that light shows through us somewhat like an individual pane within a stained glass window. Like say we're yellow. And then somebody else is red and green and blue and turquoise. And it's when we start recognizing the beauty of that light that shines through us, and we start becoming curious about what else might be out there, that we get to take that higher view, lead us to a place where we can see with thy grace, where we can see the full mosaic of your creation in humanity. And when we behold the glory of God's creation in such a beautiful mosaic of expression that we could have never considered before. It's written, Jesus said, a house divided cannot stand. This is true for us as people. When we're in a state of conflict within ourselves, we can't stand there. We have to resolve that conflict in some way for there to be soundness within our own being. And so this is true within ourselves as people. So too is it true within our partnerships, with our loved ones. And when we find ourselves entrenched in lobbying something over, it's a state of disconnection, a state of disharmony, a state of dividedness that allows the house not to stand. We may win the war, but we'll lose the relationship. So it's that curiosity of, wow, how do you see this watermelon? Let me have the courage and the strength to let go of my perception to come over here and see it with you for a moment. How you experienced it.
Yeah, a great metaphor for that is growing up in the Puget Sound area. Y'all know Mount Rainier. It's one of the largest mountain faces in the world. It's only 14,000 feet. But when you're on eastern Washington, there's so many other foothills that crowd it. It's not nearly as spectacular. It looks like a different mountain altogether. You really couldn't tell it's the same. Talking about going back to look at what Gandhi did. Gandhi changed the world. He ended colonialism. He was the first that really kind of launched this passive way of people taking their power back. And it ended centuries-old colonialism. And I'm so grateful that he answered the call that was his to do. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the civil rights in the United States, changed our country. I'm so grateful that he answered the call. One of his classmates is not here today, but from Boston University at the theology school, Curtis Rafus, right? Yeah. So he was in seminary when Dr. King was working on his doctorate.
So Gandhi and King shares this thought that a house divided cannot stand. A country divided cannot stand. And even with us and our neighbor, if our neighbor, there's a disharmony or something is happening, if we somehow don't find a common ground to connect our hearts again, there's something out of balance. It's true for us as a whole world, really a country against a country, humanity against humanity. The house of humanity has trouble and struggles and cannot stand. So what can we do? What can we do as people to find the common ground is to first become curious about knowing there is a common ground, if not just the ground upon which we stand. We are all human beings on this planet, all living life together as one. And so we become curious about how can we be in conversation with one another about those areas of disconnect to reconnect in a state of love with one another. What do you have there, love?
Well, I have the epistles, or the gospels, according to 4 dear souls. And 2 of them say Glenn. One of those must be Rowdy, because that's okay. Well, I don't know whose is who, but anyhow, some of the different descriptions of the mystical experience are this. A beautiful, smooth sculpture. It's like the Gospel of Mark, very succinct, right to the point. Rowdy. And or Glenn. Carved wooden image. It's another gospel according to Mark. Simone said, the touch I felt was hard, warm,
and textured. I felt this item was aged and full of character. That was Simone. Thank you,
I really should put my glasses on.
And Sylvia wrote, a carved wooden headboard with 2 or 3 protruding cylindrical spokes. The gospel according to Sylvia.
Serious detail. That's like Luke, more detail, really expanding on things.
Which kind of takes away the punchline, which is, which of these gospels are right? Which one's right? Exactly.
That's right.
All of them are right. And so we know in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are conflicts in those scriptures. Which one of those are right? Well, it was perceived by an individual and written down over time through voice, because the first one wasn't written until 40 AD.
70, I think, was Mark, and then or late 50s.
I should never throw out a figure when my husband is near. I love your perspective, love.
Reminds me of a joke about the engineer, but we'll talk about that later. The engineer say, man. You know, it could also be an example of the different great religions. Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam. Different expressions of the same God. Different names, different cultural understandings of what it means. The contextual awareness might be expressed differently from the other side of the world. We may not understand that. We may not understand the customs and the ways of a people. But to that culture at that time, it made great sense. And so now we look back over the thousands of years, and maybe we judge harshly that this was, I want to be careful about, but folks they hadn't gone to the moon yet. They had limited understanding. And from their limited understanding of the way the universe works, man, they're expressing something beautiful, something contemplative, something to be pondered and to go in and mull over, and to allow the Spirit in to change our lives, to soften our hard positions. When we're grabbing onto a point of view, a perspective, where's the love? You know, Mother Teresa said, if you judge someone, you have no time to love them. So love is displaced oftentimes by the ego's attachment to be right, to know I'm right. Last week we got into a little tiff, and I knew I was right.
Hence the talk today.
And Kristen just kind of paused, and she goes, I just want you to see and feel what I'm feeling. Can you just come into my shoes for just a moment and feel what I'm feeling? And in 3 seconds it was over, because I did that. I just went into it. And it just, whatever was the issue just evaporated. So insignificant. All that matters is love. And truth is love.
I had heard, and when I was growing up, that it's the stronger one who yields. Mm-hmm. It's the stronger one who's willing to leave your perspective of how you see the situation and be willing to come over and look at a new perspective. As people of faith in a certain tradition, as countrymen on the planet of Earth, let us be curious about our brothers and our sisters. Let us be open-eyed, open-hearted. Let us embrace them and understand that their perspective is their perspective, and it has a place in the grand mosaic of life, and that the light of God shines through it all. And I think what we want to do is to show you this mystical experience in closing.
Oh yeah.
So that we won't have anyone wondering what actually this was.
It's out of the bookstore.
It's out of the bookstore. It's actually from Bali. And I love it because it's like the divine, be our eyes and watch us as we grow. Watch us with your grace as we expand into a fuller understanding of life and of all our brothers and sisters on the planet Earth.
Mm-hmm. So, did you want to talk about our take-homes?
Oh, yes,
you can't
I do.
take this home unless you buy it from the bookstore.
So how do we take it home out of the sanctuary? I think the first thing is to be aware that our perception has power and it also has limitations. And so can we start to become curious about where our strength in that is and where our ability to soften, open, and heal our hearts to be encompassing of another in another perspective.
And Clay had mentioned it in his meditation, the Stephen Covey quote, seek first to understand and then to be understood. In a lecture he once said, being understood isn't the most important thing, it's just right after oxygen. So if people feel understood, they feel validated, they feel important enough to have an opinion. I was the fourth child. My opinion didn't matter. I had two older brothers that were hockey players, but they didn't care what I thought. But to be in relationship is that place where you can relate, and it goes both ways. So,
last thing, if you're intrigued by these thoughts, if you want to grow in your own consciousness, there are two individuals within our community who host what they call conscious conversations, Joni and John, and they are doing an important and significant work in Austin to help create understanding and compassion and connection through being in dialogue. So if that's interesting to you, look at the back of the bulletin. You'll find out more about conscious conversations.
And so we commit to honor all paths. Amen?
Amen.
God bless you.
God bless you all.
Thank you for joining us today. If you like the message, we invite you to like it or share it. And we also want to let you know that we're on Instagram, Twitter, and we'll see you again next Sunday on Facebook at 11:25.
We're a New Thought church where lives are transformed, and we welcome you to check us out. Check out our website, unityhills.org. We'll see you next week.
Namaste.